My parents stole my inheritance while I was bleeding in a hospital bed, just to fund my golden child sister luxury vacation to Italy. They thought I was trapped under a mountain of medical debt and a heavy cast. They had no idea my grandfather, the man they claimed was rotting away in a dementia ward, was actually wide awake, furious, and dialing his shark of a lawyer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family. My name is Talia and I am 29 years old. I work as a clinical pharmacist, which means I spend my days managing crises, but nothing could have prepared me for the crisis, waiting by my bedside. I woke up to the blinding fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. A sharp, agonizing pain radiated through my right side with every breath I took. The doctor would later tell me I had survived a severe collision, but my ribs were fractured and my leg was crushed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was my only anchor to reality. You would expect a mother seeing her youngest daughter wake up from a near-death experience to cry tears of relief. You would expect her to ask how I was feeling, but my mother, Yvonne, did not do that. As soon as my eyes fluttered open, she leaned over my bed and shoved a hard plastic clipboard onto my uninjured chest, pressing a pen into my palm. Sign this emergency. Financial power of attorney. Right now, Talia, she commanded, her voice completely devoid of warmth. I need to handle your hospital bills before the bank freezes your personal accounts today. She was wearing her Sunday church clothes, a tailored suit that screamed upper-middle-class prestige. Her hair was perfectly styled, smelling like expensive perfume. She was already calculating my financial worth while I was barely conscious. I blinked, trying to clear the heavy fog of painkillers from my brain. I could barely form a sentence. "Mom," I whispered, my throat painfully dry. "I just woke up. I cannot read this right now." My mother rolled her eyes and huffed, crossing her arms. "Do not be difficult, Talia. I am trying to help you. You are always so very stubborn. Just sign so we can get this over with." From the corner of the room, another voice chimed in, dripping with annoyance. "Can you hurry up and sign it, Talia?" My sister Dominique stepped into my line of sight. She was 32 and practically glowing in a designer silk blouse. She did not look at my bruised face. Instead, she was busy checking her reflection in the television monitor. "Your little accident completely ruined my evening gown fitting today, and I have absolutely zero time for this drama right now. The tailor is charging me a late fee today." I stared at her in disbelief. I had broken bones, but Dominique was stressed about a dress fitting. That was the dynamic of the Williams family. Dominique was the golden child who could do no wrong. She demanded perfection, and the entire family bent over backward for her. I was just the scapegoat, the independent daughter who paid for her own college degree, because my parents spent my college fund on a lavish wedding. For Dominique, I was the one they used when it was convenient. Before I could respond, a loud voice echoed from the hospital corridor right outside. "Dominique, husband." Spencer strolled into the room holding gourmet coffee. Spencer was a tall white man who called himself a venture capitalist, but mostly spent his time draining my sister's bank accounts. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing in a recovery room. He was practically shouting into his headset, bragging to someone about their upcoming anniversary trip, making sure everyone in the hospital ward could hear him talking. "Yeah, man, the Amalfi Coast is going to be epic," he said loudly, taking a sip of his coffee. "We are doing 2 weeks at a cliffside. Private yacht tours, exclusive wine tastings, the whole package. Nothing but the best for my wife. Anyway, I will send you the pictures later. I have to go deal with some annoying family business." He tapped his headset to end the call, and finally looked at me, giving me a casual wave like we were meeting at a coffee shop. "Hey there, kiddo. Glad you are awake. Listen, you really need to sign that paper for your mom so we can get out of here. We have a flight to catch in a few days and a ton of packing." The sheer audacity of my family left me speechless. I was in excruciating pain, fighting for every breath, and they were treating my hospital bed like an inconvenient detour on their way to a luxury Italian vacation. My mother tapped the clipboard against my chest again, demanding my signature. I tried to push it away, knowing better than to hand over control of my finances to a woman who idolized money. I had a trust fund waiting for me from my grandfather Elijah. I did not need her help to pay for anything. I was completely independent and financially secure. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room swung open. A stern-looking nurse in dark blue scrubs walked in, holding a thick stack of paperwork. She frowned at my mother hovering over me. "Excuse me," the nurse said sharply, stepping between my mother and my bed. "I need all visitors to step back immediately." The nurse turned her attention to my mother and handed her a bright yellow invoice. "We need a hospital deposit of $15,000 processed right now." My family stared at the bill in absolute horror, and the room went completely dead and silent. The nurse standing in the room tapped her pen against the yellow invoice, waiting for an answer. My mother, Yvonne, took a step back as if the piece of paper was infected with a disease. She crossed her arms over her expensive designer suit and looked down at me with a cold, calculating expression. "Well, Talia, you have always bragged about being an independent woman," she said, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You refused our financial help when you went to pharmacy school, so you can certainly handle your own medical expenses right now. I am not paying $15,000 out of pocket when you have your own bank accounts." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in my fractured ribs. Every single breath felt like shattered glass inside my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Fine," I whispered, reaching for my phone on the bedside table. I did not need her money anyway because I had the trust fund. My grandfather Elijah had set up a specific account for me years ago when he sold his first commercial property. He always told me that money was my foundation, my future pharmacy business waiting to be built. I knew exactly how much was in there: $147,000. It was enough to cover this hospital deposit and still leave me with plenty of capital for my dreams. My hands were shaking violently from the strong painkillers and the sudden rush of adrenaline as I unlocked my phone screen. The harsh brightness hurt my tired eyes, but I managed to open my banking application. I typed in my secure password and navigated to the linked trust account section. I was completely ready to transfer the hospital deposit and politely ask my toxic family to leave me alone so I could heal in peace. The screen loaded with a small spinning circle appearing for a few agonizing seconds before the final balance finally displayed on the screen. I blinked rapidly. I rubbed my eyes, thinking the heavy intravenous medication was making me hallucinate the numbers. I closed the banking application entirely and reopened it, forcing the system to refresh the data. The numbers on the glowing screen did not change at all. My heart dropped heavily into my stomach, and a cold sweat broke out over my entire body. The balance in my grandfather trust account was exactly $12.50. "No, no, that is absolutely impossible," I muttered, my trembling fingers frantically tapping the screen to view the recent transaction history. The new page loaded, showing a massive withdrawal made exactly 3 weeks ago for the exact amount of $146,987. The transfer destination was an external checking account belonging directly to my father. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. I looked up from my phone, my vision blurring with hot, panicked tears. "Dad," I choked out, looking at my father Desmond, who was standing quietly near the hospital door. "Where is my money? Where is the trust fund?" My father shifted uncomfortably, moving his weight from one foot to the other. He would not even look me in the eye. He looked down at his expensive polished leather shoes and cleared his throat loudly. "Well, Talia, we had to make a slight adjustment with the family finances recently," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weekend weather. "I used my legal trustee access to move those funds temporarily because your sister Dominique has been going through a very difficult time lately." I stared at him, completely paralyzed by what I was hearing. "A difficult time?" I asked, my voice trembling with shock. Dominique rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. "Yes, a difficult time, Talia," she snapped, stepping much closer to my hospital bed. "Spencer lost a massive venture capital contract last month, and it has been incredibly stressful for our marriage. I have been dealing with severe anxiety and deep depression because of it. The family doctor said I desperately needed a change of scenery to protect my fragile mental health. My father nodded in solid agreement, looking at me as if I was the one being completely unreasonable. So we decided to use the trust fund to pay for their luxury 2-week vacation to the Amalfi Coast, he explained smoothly without an ounce of guilt. Spencer needed to network with international investors in Italy anyway, so it is really an investment in the family future. You understand, right? You have a very good salary at the hospital. You do not need that money right now as much as your sister does. I felt a violent wave of nausea wash over my entire body. They stole $147,000 of my inheritance to fund a luxury Italian vacation for my spoiled sister and her unemployed parasite of a husband. They took the money my grandfather specifically set aside for my future business and blew it on private cliffside yachts and expensive wine while I was lying in a hospital bed with crushed bones. I tried to sit up, the medical monitors around me, beeping wildly as my heart rate skyrocketed in pure anger. That was my money. I screamed, the sharp pain in my chest flaring up terribly. You had no right to touch it. That was Grandpa Elijah money for my pharmacy. My mother slammed her manicured hand down on the metal edge of my bed, her eyes flashing with furious anger. "Do not raise your voice at us, you ungrateful child!" she hissed viciously. "We are your parents, and we make the financial decisions for the good of the family name. You have always been so utterly selfish, Talia, always thinking about your own little career instead of supporting your sister when she is depressed. You should be deeply ashamed of yourself for making a scene like this in public." Spencer chuckled lightly from the dark corner of the room, checking his fake gold watch. "Look, guys, we really need to get going," he said, completely unfazed by my tears of betrayal. "We have that exclusive wine tasting event at the country club in 30 minutes, and we absolutely cannot be late. I still need to finalize our first-class flight upgrades for tomorrow morning. Let her figure out her own hospital bills because she is a big girl now." My mother smoothed out her tailored blazer and picked up her designer handbag. She looked down at me one last time, her face a perfect mask of absolute disgust. "Have the hospital set up a payment plan, Talia?" she instructed coldly. "We will visit you when we get back from Italy next month. Try to fix your terrible attitude by then." With that, my mother, my father, my sister, and her husband turned around and walked straight out of the hospital room. They did not look back even once. They just walked out the door, leaving me entirely alone, the sound of their expensive shoes echoing loudly down the quiet hallway. I was left completely penniless, unable to move, trapped under a heavy leg cast with a $15,000 medical bill waiting to be paid. The nurse stood at the foot of my bed holding the yellow invoice, looking at me with a terrible mixture of pity and impatience. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably, feeling like my entire world had just collapsed and I had absolutely no one left to save me. The nurse shifted her weight uncomfortably, staring at the yellow invoice. The silence in the hospital room was completely deafening. I lay there staring at the ceiling as hot tears streamed down my bruised cheeks. My chest heaved with heavy sobs, sending sharp waves of agony through my fractured ribs. I was entirely alone. The people who were supposed to protect me had just robbed me blind while I was fighting for my life. They had taken my grandfather's hard-earned money and left me to drown in medical debt. The nurse placed the yellow paper on the table next to my bed. She told me she would give me time to process everything. She said I could call the billing department later to arrange a payment plan. I just closed my eyes, wishing I could disappear. The financial betrayal was a heavy weight pressing down on my broken body. That trust fund was a symbol of my grandfather believing in my future. Grandpa Elijah had grown up with absolutely nothing. He worked grueling construction jobs for decades before buying his first commercial property. He built his real estate business brick by brick so his family would never struggle. He saw that same relentless drive in me when I decided to become a clinical pharmacist. He set up that account so I could open my own pharmacy one day. Now, all his years of hard work were going to be wasted on luxury suites and expensive wine for my spoiled sister. My parents had treated his legacy like a personal piggy bank. They always claimed they were managing his estate because his mind was gone. 2 years ago, my mother Yvonne convinced the entire family that Grandpa Elijah had severe dementia. She said he was a danger to himself and needed professional supervision. They moved him into an assisted living facility 50 miles away. They took over his finances, his properties, and his medical decisions. Whenever I visited him, he would just sit in his chair staring blankly out the window, barely speaking. My mother told me it was pointless to talk to him because his brain was deteriorating rapidly. I believed her because she had all the paperwork to prove it. I mourned the loss of my brilliant grandfather, even though he was still physically alive. I felt a fresh wave of grief thinking about how helpless he was while they drained his wealth. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of my hospital room began to creak open very slowly. I did not open my eyes, assuming it was just another doctor coming to check my vital signs or adjust my pain medication. The rubber wheels of a medical chair squeaked softly against the pristine linoleum floor. I heard the steady mechanical sound of someone rolling themselves into the room. The nurse gasped softly in surprise. I finally forced my swollen eyes open and turned my head toward the doorway. My heart stopped beating in my chest. I thought the heavy intravenous drugs were finally making me hallucinate a ghost from my past. Sitting perfectly upright in a standard hospital wheelchair was my grandfather Elijah. He was wearing a neatly pressed tweed suit and a crisp white button-down shirt. He did not look like a frail old man rotting away in a dementia ward. He looked exactly like the formidable business tycoon who used to command boardrooms with absolute authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed and his posture was rigid and proud. But the most shocking thing of all was his eyes. They were not blank or confused or lost in the fog of a deteriorating mind. His dark brown eyes were incredibly sharp-focused and burning with an intense fiery rage. He looked directly at me and then shifted his intense gaze to the nurse standing awkwardly by the bed. "Give us a moment alone, please," he said to the nurse. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely steady. There was absolutely no hesitation or confusion in his tone. The nurse looked at him and then looked at me, clearly unsure of what to do. I gave her a tiny nod of confirmation. She quickly gathered her medical charts and scurried out of the room, pulling the heavy door completely shut behind her. The click of the door latch echoed loudly in the quiet room. Grandpa Elijah slowly rolled his wheelchair right up to the side of my bed. He reached out with his strong, weathered hand and gently wiped a tear from my bruised cheek. "Stop crying, Talia," he said softly but firmly. "William's women do not waste their tears on thieves and cowards." I stared at him, completely mesmerized and terrified all at once. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "How are you here right now? Mom said you could not even remember your own name anymore. She said you were locked in the secure wing of the facility." A dark, bitter smile spread across my grandfather's weathered face. He leaned back in his wheelchair and crossed his arms over his chest. "Your mother is a very foolish woman who believes exactly what she wants to believe," he replied, his voice dripping with cold contempt. "I let them think my mind was gone, so I could finally see who they truly were behind closed doors. And today they proved exactly how entirely rotten they have become." He slowly reached into the deep inside pocket of his tweed suit jacket. He pulled out an old black flip phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. He flipped it open with a sharp, authoritative snap. His thumb hovered over the worn-out keypad, ready to make a call that would destroy everything my toxic parents had built. The cold air in the quiet hospital room grew incredibly heavy with silent anticipation. Grandpa Elijah stared at the glowing screen of his old phone and narrowed his sharp eyes. "The vultures picked the wrong carcass," he muttered. Grandpa Elijah pressed a single button on the worn keypad. He placed the old black phone gently on my hospital bed so I could hear the conversation. The phone rang twice before a deep professional voice answered on the other end. "Julian speaking," the voice said. Grandpa leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Julian." "It is Elijah," he said calmly. "It is time to initiate the protocol we discussed." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of a leather chair squeaking as the lawyer presumably sat up straight in shock. Elijah the lawyer asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Are you calling me from the facility? Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine, Julian," my grandfather replied smoothly. "I am currently sitting in a hospital room with my granddaughter Talia. She was in a terrible car accident, but she is going to survive. However, the rest of our family is not going to survive what is coming next. Bring the master files to St. Jude Hospital immediately. We have a lot of work to do." I stared at my grandfather in absolute shock as he ended the call and snapped the flip phone shut. I could not comprehend what was happening. For 2 entire years I had watched him stare blankly at walls. I had spoon-fed him applesauce while my mother complained about the cost of his adult diapers. I had cried by his bedside mourning the brilliant man I thought was gone forever. "You faked it," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You pretended to lose your mind for 2 whole years. Why would you do something like that to yourself? Why would you let them lock you away in that awful place?" Grandpa Elijah sighed heavily, and the tough exterior he projected seemed to soften just a fraction. He reached out and gently patted my hand where it rested on the hospital blanket. "Because I needed to know the truth, Talia," he explained quietly. "When you build an empire from nothing, you spend your whole life surrounded by people who only want your money. I always knew your mother was obsessed with status. I knew your father was too weak to stand up to her, and I knew they spoiled Dominique to a fault. But I needed to know exactly how deep their greed ran. I needed to see what they would do when they thought they had absolute control over the old man and his bank accounts." He looked away for a moment, staring out the hospital window at the gray sky. "They showed their true colors immediately." He continued, his voice hardening again. "As soon as the doctors diagnosed me with early-stage dementia, based on the symptoms I was acting out, your mother swooped in like a starving hawk. She took the medical power of attorney and shipped me off to that facility without a second thought. She did not even pack my favorite books. She just wanted the keys to the kingdom." "But what about my trust fund?" I asked, the pain in my chest flaring up as I remembered the zero balance. "Why did they steal my money if they already had control of yours?" Grandpa Elijah let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Because they do not actually have control of my money, Talia," he said, his eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. "That $147,000 was bait. It was a test. I intentionally left that specific account outside of my primary legal protections just to see if they would steal from their own flesh and blood. I wanted to see if their greed had any limits. Today they proved that they have absolutely no boundaries left. They robbed a wounded girl in a hospital bed to fund a vacation." The heavy door of the hospital room swung open again, interrupting our conversation. A tall, distinguished older gentleman in a sharp gray suit walked into the room, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked at my grandfather and let out a long breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really did it," Elijah Julian said, walking over to the bed. "You sat in that miserable facility for 2 years playing the fool. I was starting to worry you had actually lost your mind and forgotten about our plan." Grandpa Elijah smirked and gestured for the lawyer to open his briefcase. "I never forget anything, Julian," he said sharply. "Now explain the legal reality to my granddaughter. She thinks her parents are wealthy and powerful right now. Tell her the truth." Julian placed his leather briefcase on the small hospital tray table and clicked the brass locks open. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper. He looked down at me with a sympathetic but professional expression. "Talia, your parents think they control the Williams family empire because your mother holds a general power of attorney," Julian explained smoothly. "But a power of attorney only applies to assets owned directly by the individual. Your grandfather is a very smart man. 5 years ago, he transferred every single significant asset he owned into a revocable living trust." I blinked, trying to process the legal terminology through the haze of my pain medication. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, wincing as I shifted my crushed leg. Julian smiled thinly and tapped the thick stack of papers. "It means your grandfather does not technically own anything in his own name. and therefore your mother power of attorney is completely useless over the real wealth. The sprawling colonial mansion your parents currently live in is owned by the trust. The luxury cars they drive are leased by the trust. The massive monthly allowance your sister Dominique receives to fund her lavish lifestyle is a discretionary distribution from the trust. My jaw dropped slightly as the magnitude of what Julian was saying began to sink in. Even Spencer is trapped. Julian continued flipping to a specific page in the document. That brilliant venture capital business your brother-in-law claims to run was started with a $2 million seed loan from your grandfather. But it was not a gift. It is a callable loan held by the trust, meaning the trust can demand full repayment at absolutely any time with 30 days' notice. I looked from the lawyer back to my grandfather, who was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, watching me absorb the information. Your mother thinks she is the queen of the castle because she can sign my medical forms. Grandpa Elijah said, his voice cold and resolute. She thinks she has secured her luxurious future and Dominique inheritance. She thinks she can steal your business money with zero consequences because she believes the old man is brain dead and cannot stop her. Grandpa Elijah leaned closer to my bed, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. But the truth is, Talia, they are nothing but glorified tenants living in my house and spending my money. I am the sole trustee of the Revocable Living Trust. I have absolute control over every single dime they touch. If I want to, I can turn off the faucet completely. Julian closed the legal folder with a sharp, authoritative thud that echoed in the quiet hospital room. He looked at me very seriously. Your grandfather is right, Talia, Julian said quietly. Despite their designer clothes and their expensive country club memberships, your parents and your sister are entirely broke. Legally speaking, they own absolutely nothing. The silence in the hospital room was absolute as Julian finished his explanation. I stared at the thick stack of watermarked paper on the tray table, trying to wrap my mind around the sheer magnitude of what I had just learned. My parents had spent my entire life walking around our neighborhood like royalty. My mother treated the church congregation like her own personal fan club, bragging constantly about her massive home and her wealthy, successful family. My sister Dominique walked through the local luxury boutiques acting as if she owned them, swiping her platinum cards without ever looking at the price tags. And Spencer was always loudly giving unsolicited financial advice to anyone who would listen at family barbecues. All of it was a complete and utter lie. The empire they were so violently protecting and stealing to maintain was entirely an illusion built on the quiet genius of the elderly man sitting in a wheelchair right next to my bed. Grandpa Elijah reached out and tapped the tray table with a strong, rhythmic beat. Enough explaining, Julian, he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. We do not have time to sit around and marvel at my foresight. We have a thief to catch and an empire to secure. Draft the transfer papers right now. I want my daughter completely stripped of her provisional managerial rights before the sun sets today. Julian nodded quickly, opening a fresh leather-bound legal pad. He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and began writing rapidly. I watched as the lawyer drafted the legal instruments right there in my hospital room, surrounded by the steady beeping of my heart monitor. Grandpa Elijah dictated the terms clearly and coldly. He officially revoked the power of attorney he had previously granted my mother Yvonne. He dissolved the Provisional Management Committee that allowed my father Desmond to sign checks on behalf of the trust. Every single financial privilege my family had enjoyed for the past 2 years was being systematically dismantled with every stroke of Julian pen. Then Grandpa Elijah turned his intense dark eyes toward me. And now, Talia, he said softly, but with immense weight, I am naming you as the sole trustee and the primary executor of the Revocable Living Trust. You will have immediate legal authority over every bank account, every property deed, and every investment portfolio. You will hold the keys to the entire Williams family legacy. I felt a sudden wave of panic wash over me. The pain in my ribs flared up as my breathing grew shallow. Grandpa, I cannot do that, I stammered, gripping the edge of my hospital blanket. I am just a clinical pharmacist. I know how to manage medications and patient charts, not multi-million-dollar real estate portfolios. I do not know the first thing about running an empire like yours. Grandpa Elijah let out a harsh laugh that filled the small room. You are a smart young woman who built her own career without a single penny of my money, he said proudly. You know how to work hard and you know the value of a dollar. That is all you need to know. Besides, you will have Julian to guide you through the legal maze. I am not giving you this power because I want you to become a real estate tycoon, Talia. I am giving it to you because you are the only person in this family with a shred of integrity left. You are the only one who did not try to pick the pockets of a sick old man. He leaned closer to my bed, his expression turning deadly serious. I built this wealth to protect our bloodline, not to fund the delusions of a fake venture capitalist and a spoiled golden child. They stole your future today, Talia. They took the money I left for your pharmacy and laughed in your face while you were bleeding in a hospital bed. Are you going to let them get away with that? The image of my mother shoving that clipboard onto my crushed chest flashed through my mind. I remembered Spencer bragging loudly about private yachts while I was struggling to breathe. I remembered my father looking at the floor, refusing to protect me while they stole my inheritance. The panic in my chest was slowly replaced by a cold, calculating anger. I looked at the legal documents resting on the tray table. The power to destroy them was sitting right there waiting for my signature. I will do it, I said, my voice steady and completely void of fear. I reached for the heavy silver pen Julian was holding out to me. Despite the sharp agony radiating through my fractured ribs, I gripped the pen firmly and signed my name on the dotted lines. With those few strokes of ink, the power dynamic of the entire Williams family shifted permanently. I went from being a helpless, penniless victim trapped in a hospital bed to the undisputed legal owner of a massive financial empire. Julian gathered the signed documents and placed them carefully back into his leather briefcase. The transfer is legally binding as of this exact moment, he confirmed, closing the brass locks with a satisfying click. You are now the sole trustee, Talia. What are your first orders? I looked at Grandpa Elijah, and a silent understanding passed between us. We do nothing, I said, leaning back against my hospital pillows. If we confront them right now, my mother will just play the victim. She will cry and manipulate the church congregation into thinking we are abusing her. Spencer will probably try to hide the money he stole from my trust fund. We need to let them get comfortable. We need to let them pack their designer luggage for their luxury trip to Italy. We need to let them throw that ridiculously expensive farewell party they have been planning. Grandpa Elijah smiled a dark, predatory smile. We let them dig their own graves, he agreed, nodding slowly. They think they have won. Let them celebrate their victory until they are completely surrounded by their own lies. Julian agreed to the strategy. He promised to keep the legal changes completely confidential until we were ready to strike. Grandpa Elijah was quietly transported back to a secure safe house owned by the trust, far away from the facility where my mother thought he was rotting. I spent the next 4 days recovering in the hospital, playing the part of the defeated daughter. I ignored the few text messages my mother sent demanding to know if I had set up a payment plan for my medical bills. I focused entirely on healing my broken body and preparing for the war ahead. When the doctors finally discharged me, I was fitted with a heavy walking boot and a pair of sturdy crutches. Julian arranged for a private car to pick me up at the hospital entrance. He drove me directly to the safe house where Grandpa Elijah was waiting. As soon as I settled onto the comfortable sofa in the secure living room, Julian handed me a sleek silver laptop. It was securely connected to the master banking portal of the trust. My physical wounds were still causing me immense pain, but my mind was sharper than ever. I opened the laptop and logged into the system, ready to follow the digital trail of my stolen inheritance. It was time to find out exactly where Spencer had hidden my $147,000. The silver laptop hummed quietly on my lap as I sat in the dimly lit living room of the safe house. Julian sat in an armchair across from me, with his own computer open and ready to assist. Despite the heavy cast on my leg and the sharp ache in my fractured ribs, I felt an intense surge of adrenaline. I navigated through the secure banking portal of my grandfather empire. The screen displayed decades of carefully managed wealth, but I only cared about one specific number. I clicked on the transaction history for my personal trust account. The withdrawal of $147,000 stared back at me like an open wound. I took a deep breath and clicked on the routing number where the money had been sent. My parents had claimed the money was urgently needed to fund a 2-week luxury vacation to the Amalfi Coast. They said Spencer needed to network with international investors to save his struggling venture capital firm. They painted a picture of a glamorous Italian getaway meant to cure my sister Dominique of her supposed depression. I fully expected to see the money transferred to a high-end travel agency or an exclusive cliffside resort in Europe. But the digital trail told a completely different story. The funds did not go to a travel agency. The money was wired directly into a corporate checking account registered to a company called Apex Innovations. I read the name out loud to Julian. He quickly typed the company name into a legal database on his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up the public business records. Apex Innovations was not a venture capital firm. It was a shell company registered to a post office box in Delaware. Julian dug deeper, accessing the internal financial records my grandfather had secured through his private investigators. The truth about my brother-in-law Spencer began to unravel right in front of my eyes. Spencer was not a brilliant venture capitalist. He was a complete fraud running a textbook Ponzi scheme. He had taken the initial $2 million seed loan from my grandfather trust years ago and blown it on expensive cars, designer clothes, and country club memberships. When he ran out of money, he started soliciting investments from wealthy members of my mother church congregation. He promised them massive returns on tech startups that did not actually exist. He used the money from new investors to pay the old investors, keeping the illusion alive while skimming a massive salary for himself to keep Dominique dressed in designer silk. But the scheme had finally collapsed last month. Julian pulled up a series of highly confidential legal threats sent to Spencer. 2 prominent investors from the church had discovered the fraud. They had hired aggressive corporate lawyers and were preparing to hand all their evidence over to the federal authorities. They gave Spencer a strict deadline to return their principal investment or face immediate criminal charges. The total amount they demanded was exactly $145,000. Spencer had panicked. He had no money left and his fake empire was crumbling. So he manipulated my desperate parents. He convinced them he just needed a temporary loan to secure a massive international contract in Italy. He played on my mother's obsession with status and my sister's fragile ego. He knew my parents had provisional access to my trust fund, and he knew they would gladly sacrifice my future to protect their golden child. I stared at the laptop screen, feeling a sickening mixture of horror and vindication. My parents had not stolen my inheritance to pay for a vacation. They had stolen it to pay off angry victims of a Ponzi scheme. They had unknowingly funded a federal crime just to keep up appearances. My mother had stood in my hospital room in her Sunday church clothes demanding my money, while her precious son-in-law was busy defrauding her own congregation. The sheer hypocrisy of my family was absolutely staggering. I looked at Julian and pointed out the remaining $2,000 from the stolen funds. I asked him where the rest of my money went since the legal settlement only covered $145,000. Julian typed a few more commands into his secure terminal, tracking the final digital footprints of the stolen money. The room was perfectly silent except for the clicking of his keyboard. He found a single transaction made just 2 days ago. It was a charge for a commercial airline ticket. I felt a bitter smirk form on my lips, thinking Spencer had actually bought himself a flight to Italy just to keep up the charade for Dominique. But Julian shook his head slowly as he read the flight details on his screen. He looked up at me with a grim expression. "There is no trip to the Amalfi Coast," he said, his voice completely flat. "There are no reservations at a cliffside villa, and there are no exclusive wine tastings." Spencer did not buy 2 tickets to Europe for a romantic anniversary trip. He bought exactly 1 ticket. My heart pounded against my bruised ribs as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I asked Julian where the single ticket was headed. Julian turned his laptop screen so I could see the airline confirmation directly. The ticket was a one-way flight to a small island nation known for having absolutely no extradition treaties with the United States. Spencer was not planning a luxury getaway to save his marriage. He was planning to run away forever. He had used my money to silence the angry investors, just long enough to pack his bags without raising any alarms. He was going to attend the lavish farewell party my mother was throwing for them tomorrow night. He was going to play the role of the perfect successful husband one last time and then disappear into the night. He was going to leave my sister Dominique to wake up entirely alone in an empty mansion. He was going to leave my parents to face the massive financial fallout when the federal investigators inevitably came knocking on their door. Spencer was planning to flee the country alone, leaving his golden child wife to take the fall for his crimes. Julian closed the airline confirmation screen, leaving the room in a heavy silence. I sat back against the cushions of the safe house sofa, feeling a strange mixture of disgust and dark satisfaction. Spencer was actually going to abandon my sister and leave my parents to face the federal authorities all by themselves. He was a coward running away with my inheritance just to save his own skin. He had absolutely no intention of taking Dominique with him to that island. He was going to let her wake up in an empty mansion with federal agents banging on her front door. I looked down at my phone resting on the glass coffee table, feeling a sudden chill in the warm room. Right on cue, the screen lit up, buzzing violently against the glass surface. The caller identification displayed my mother name accompanied by a picture of her smiling perfectly at a country club gala. I glanced at the digital clock on the wall, realizing it was exactly 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. Church service had just ended in our affluent neighborhood. The Williams family was supposed to be standing in the grand foyer of the sanctuary, shaking hands with the pastor and showing off their expensive designer outfits. That was their weekly ritual of pretending to be the perfect faithful family. I picked up the phone and swiped the screen to answer, pressing the speaker button. I also tapped the screen of my laptop to activate the voice recording software Julian had installed for me earlier that morning. My mother's voice exploded through the small speaker before I could even say hello. "Where in the world are you, Talia?" she screamed, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet living room. "I have been fielding questions from the entire congregation all morning because you failed to show up for Sunday service. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is for me to stand in front of my friends and explain why my youngest daughter cannot even bother to attend church with her own family?" She sounded completely unhinged, acting as if missing a church service was a greater tragedy than nearly dying in a car crash. I adjusted my heavy leg cast on the sofa and spoke calmly into the microphone. "I was recently in a severe car accident, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I have broken ribs and a crushed leg. I was literally discharged from the hospital just a few days ago. I am currently recovering under doctor orders." My mother let out a loud, dramatic scoff that vibrated harshly through the speaker. "Oh, please do not play the victim with me," she snapped viciously. "You have a walking boot and crutches. You are perfectly capable of sitting in a pew for 2 hours to show your respect to God and to this family. You are just being spiteful because we had to borrow your trust fund money to help your sister." She did not stop there. She launched into a massive, breathless tirade about the affluent Williams family name and how much intense pressure she was under to maintain our pristine image in the community. She told me that Pastor Davis had specifically asked about me, and she was forced to lie and say I was busy working a stressful shift at the pharmacy. She said I was selfishly making her look like a terrible mother in front of all her wealthy socialite friends. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family, Talia," she yelled, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that made Julian cringe across the room. "Your sister is dealing with severe clinical depression, and your brother-in-law is working around the clock to save his massive business, but they still managed to come to church today looking absolutely flawless. They understand the critical importance of family unity and public image." I looked at Julian, who was shaking his head in sheer disbelief, as the recording software captured every single toxic word spilling from her mouth. I pressed the microphone button again, wanting her to put everything on the permanent record. "So my physical pain is less important than your public image?" I asked quietly. My mother did not hesitate for a single second. Your terrible attitude is exactly why you will always be second best in this family, she hissed venomously. If you do not show up to the farewell party tomorrow night and smile for the cameras, I swear to you, I will completely disown you. I will cut you out of my will and erase you from this family. You will not get another dime from us, and you will not be welcome in my house ever again. You will be entirely on your own, Talia. I let her heavy, angry breathing fill the silence for a long moment. I smiled coldly, staring at the audio waveform recording steadily on my laptop screen. That is perfectly fine, Mom, I said softly. I will see you at the party tomorrow night. I ended the call before she could say another word, and immediately saved the audio file to a secure encrypted folder. I had just recorded her openly threatening to disown me for being injured. It was a perfect piece of evidence to add to our growing arsenal against her blinding arrogance. Julian handed me a cup of warm tea and suggested I take a break from the digital screens. He pointed to a large cardboard box sitting in the dark corner of the room. Grandpa Elijah had asked one of his private security guards to stop by his old properties and collect all the forwarded mail that had accumulated over the past 2 years. Julian said there might be some useful financial statements buried in the junk mail, and told me to sort through it while he made some phone calls to his private investigators. I pulled the heavy box closer to the sofa and began sifting through the massive piles of paper. There were dozens of property tax assessments, landscaping bills, and glossy real estate magazines addressed to my grandfather. But my parents had also used some of these old properties as mailing addresses for various shell accounts over the years, trying to hide their excessive credit card debts from public records. I sorted the envelopes into neat piles, tossing the useless junk mail onto the floor. My fingers suddenly brushed against a thick, stiff manila envelope buried at the very bottom of the box. The envelope was heavily sealed and stamped with the intimidating official seal of the Department of the Treasury. It was a formal notice from the Internal Revenue Service sent directly from the federal government. The mailing address was an old warehouse my grandfather owned, but the recipient names printed boldly on the front were Desmond and Yvonne Williams. I frowned, feeling a sudden sharp spike of anxiety as I ripped the thick paper open. I pulled out a massive stack of formal tax audits and final collection notices. But as I scanned the dense legal paragraphs, my eyes locked onto a single terrifying detail buried in the fine print. The massive federal tax debt was not filed by my parents at all. It was filed by Spencer, who had secretly used their personal information to guarantee his failing business. I stared at the federal document, realizing Spencer had done something far more dangerous than just running a Ponzi scheme. The thick paperwork in my trembling hands outlined a massive federal tax evasion case. Spencer had not just borrowed money from trusting church investors to fund his fake lifestyle. He had entirely stopped paying federal taxes for his shell company Apex Innovations for over 3 years. The Internal Revenue Service had finally caught up with him, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes and severe financial penalties. But instead of facing the consequences, like a man, Spencer had found a completely ruthless way to shield himself from the federal government. He had somehow gotten his hands on my parents' social security numbers and their most sensitive personal identification details. I looked at Julian, who was already leaning over the glass coffee table to read the dense legal paragraphs. Spencer had used my parents' pristine credit scores and clean background checks to take out massive fraudulent corporate loans. He had legally bound my mother Yvonne and my father Desmond as the primary guarantors for his failing shell company. He had literally forged their signatures on federal tax documents, pledging their personal assets to the government to delay the tax collectors. My parents were so completely blinded by his fake venture capitalist charm and their own desperate need to show off a successful white son-in-law that they probably handed over their sensitive information willingly. They likely thought they were just helping him with some routine background check for a massive international investment. Julian ran his hand over his face, letting out a heavy, tired sigh. "Talia," he said, his voice gravely serious, Do you understand what this actually means? I nodded slowly, feeling a strange numb sensation spreading through my chest. It means my parents are legally responsible for a massive federal tax debt. I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Julian shook his head grimly, staring at the government seal. It is much worse than just a massive debt, Talia, he explained quietly. Spencer committed aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud using their names and their credentials. Because your parents signed those initial trust documents giving him that seed money years ago, the government will view them as active co-conspirators in his Ponzi scheme. When the federal agents finally raid Apex Innovations, they will not just seize your parents' bank accounts to pay off the debt. They will arrest them. My mother and father were facing complete financial bankruptcy and actual federal prison time. I sat back on the soft sofa, processing the absolute magnitude of the betrayal. My parents had stolen my grandfather's inheritance and verbally abused me to protect a man who had secretly built a federal prison cell with their names written right on it. They were willing to completely disown their own injured daughter just to maintain the fragile illusion of a perfect family while their golden son-in-law was busy destroying their entire lives. A small, bitter laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet safe house. They really thought they were the smartest people in the room, I whispered, staring blankly at the terrifying IRS notices scattered on the table. They threw me away for a man who is going to leave them holding the bag for a federal crime. Julian closed his laptop and looked at me expectantly, waiting for my command. What is your decision, Talia? He asked, leaning back in his chair. As the newly appointed sole trustee, you have the absolute power to notify the authorities right now and stop Spencer from leaving the country tomorrow. We could call the police today and have him arrested for fraud before the party even begins. I looked down at the heavy medical walking boot strapped to my crushed leg and remembered the cold look of absolute disgust on my mother's face in the hospital room. I remembered my sister Dominique complaining about her expensive dress fitting while I was crying in physical agony. I remembered Spencer loudly bragging about his luxury Italian vacation, using the money my grandfather saved for my future pharmacy business. No, I said, my voice completely steady, cold, and resolute. We are not calling the police today. If we stop the party right now, my mother will spend the rest of her miserable life claiming I ruined their flawless reputation out of pure jealousy. We are going to let them have their perfect luxury farewell dinner. We are going to let them stand in front of all their wealthy friends and the church pastor and brag about how incredibly successful they are. Julian raised his eyebrows slightly, waiting for my specific instructions. I handed the federal IRS documents back to him across the table. I want you to contact the trust banking administrators immediately, I instructed smoothly. I want every single platinum credit card, every checking account, and every line of credit associated with the Williams family to be completely frozen. But do not execute the freeze right now. I added, a dark, calculated smile forming on my face. I want you to schedule the total asset freeze to take effect tomorrow night at exactly 8 o'clock. Julian slowly broke into a wide, appreciative smile, understanding exactly what I was planning to do. 8 o'clock is right in the middle of their dinner service, he noted, pulling his laptop open and typing the instructions into his secure banking portal. They will be ordering their expensive champagne and showing off their fake wealth for their elite guests. I nodded, confirming the ruthless plan. I wanted Spencer to feel the exact humiliating moment his fake empire finally collapsed. I wanted my mother to experience the ultimate public humiliation she was so desperately afraid of. I wanted Dominique to watch her perfect, golden life shatter into a million unfixable pieces in front of an audience. We spent the rest of the long afternoon finalizing the digital trap. Julian uploaded the federal IRS documents and the undeniable evidence of the Ponzi scheme to a secure cloud server ready to be displayed at a moment's notice. Grandpa Elijah stayed in the spare bedroom, resting and preparing his own strength for the massive confrontation ahead. I practiced walking slowly with my heavy aluminum crutches, making sure I could navigate the upscale restaurant dining room without showing any physical weakness. I packed a small leather bag with the printed copies of the single flight itinerary, proving Spencer was planning to abandon his wife and flee the country alone. Everything was perfectly set in motion for their destruction. The next 24 hours felt like an agonizing eternity. I sat in the quiet safe house watching the digital clock tick closer and closer to the inevitable explosion. I did not bother answering any more angry, demanding text messages from my mother or my sister. I just watched the sun slowly dip below the tree line, painting the evening sky in dark, dramatic shades of purple and black. The night of the luxurious Bon Voyage party had finally arrived. My parents were currently walking into the most exclusive five-star restaurant in the city, wearing their absolute finest designer clothes, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a permanent financial grave. It was time for the Williams family to finally pay the bill. The private dining room at the Grand Zenith restaurant was a masterclass in ridiculous extravagance. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the long mahogany table. The room was specifically reserved for the city elite, and my mother had made sure to invite every single person she needed to impress. I stood hidden in the quiet hallway just outside the heavy oak doors, leaning heavily on my aluminum crutches. My chest ached with every breath, but I refused to take any pain medication tonight. I needed my mind to be completely sharp for what was about to happen. I looked down at my grandfather sitting perfectly still in his wheelchair. He was wearing his best tailored charcoal suit, looking like a king ready to reclaim his stolen throne. Through the cracked doorway I could hear the loud booming voice of my mother Yvonne holding court. She had invited the entire upper echelon of her wealthy social circle. The women from the church auxiliary board were there, dripping in diamonds and sipping ridiculously expensive champagne. Pastor Davis sat near the head of the table, nodding along to whatever lies my father Desmond was telling him. The room absolutely reeked of expensive imported perfume and fake generational wealth. Everyone was smiling and laughing, completely unaware that the lavish spread of roasted duck and imported caviar they were about to eat was being paid for with stolen money and forged federal documents. My parents had spared absolutely no expense to make sure this farewell dinner looked like a royal send-off. I peered closer through the narrow gap in the doors and saw Spencer sitting right next to my sister Dominique. Spencer was wearing a brand new custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire first year of pharmacy school tuition. He was swirling a glass of amber whiskey, laughing loudly at a joke one of the church elders had just made. He looked so incredibly relaxed and confident for a man who was planning to flee the country the very next morning. He was playing the role of the generous, successful son-in-law to absolute perfection. He was completely enjoying the adoration of the room, soaking up the praise from people he was actively defrauding. Dominique was sitting right beside him, complaining to a waiter that her sparkling water was not cold enough. She was wearing the exact same designer evening gown she had been fitting on the day I almost died in my car crash. Her blonde highlights caught the light of the chandeliers as she leaned into Spencer, acting like the luckiest woman in the world. They were the picture-perfect affluent couple, completely oblivious to the massive federal trap waiting for them. They thought they had won, and they thought I was sitting at home crying over my empty bank account. My mother tapped her crystal glass with a silver dessert spoon to get the attention of the room. The soft chatter died down as all eyes turned to her. She placed a hand over her heart, putting on her best tragic and humble face. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight to celebrate Spencer and Dominique," she announced, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "As you know, Spencer is taking our beautiful Dominique on a luxury tour of Italy tomorrow to celebrate his massive new venture capital merger. We are just so incredibly blessed to have such a hard-working and devoted man in our family to carry on our legacy." The guests clapped politely, and Pastor Davis smiled warmly at Spencer, raising his water glass in a silent toast. But my mother was not done playing the victim for her audience. She lowered her head and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, letting the silence stretch for effect. "I only wish my dear father Elijah and my youngest daughter Talia could be here tonight," she continued, wiping a fake tear from her perfectly made-up eye. Sadly, my father has taken a terrible turn for the worse. The doctors at the memory care facility say he is completely unresponsive and rapidly failing. We are preparing for the worst very soon, and poor Talia is home resting from her terrible accident, too heartbroken and injured to join us. But we know they are here with us in spirit as we celebrate this wonderful family milestone. Pastor Davis bowed his head slightly, murmuring a soft prayer for my supposedly dying grandfather. Grandpa Elijah let out a low, dark chuckle from his wheelchair beside me. "I think it is time to resurrect the dead," he whispered to me, his eyes flashing with brilliant anger. I tightened my grip on the rubber handles of my crutches, feeling a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I pushed open the heavy oak doors with my shoulder, letting them swing wide open with a loud, dramatic thud that echoed through the private dining room. The heavy silence fell over the room instantly. I stepped into the bright light of the crystal chandeliers, my heavy medical boot thumping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I balanced my weight on my crutches and reached back to pull Grandpa Elijah and his wheelchair directly into the center of the doorway for everyone to clearly see. The reaction was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. The wealthy socialites froze in their seats with their champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. Pastor Davis blinked in sheer shock, staring directly at the man he had just been told was lying on his deathbed. But the look on my family faces was the true prize of the entire evening. My mother Yvonne dropped her silver spoon onto the table with a loud, sharp clatter. Her perfectly manicured face drained of all its color, turning an awful shade of chalky white. Her jaw hung open, unable to form a single word as she stared at her father sitting upright and looking completely healthy and aware. My father Desmond gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white against the dark wood. He looked like he had just seen a ghost walk out of a freshly dug grave. Dominique gasped loudly, dropping her expensive linen napkin onto the floor and shrinking back into her chair. And Spencer, the brilliant fake venture capitalist, suddenly looked like a trapped animal in the headlights of a speeding truck. The arrogant, confident smirk vanished from his face, entirely replaced by a look of absolute sheer panic. He knew exactly what Grandpa Elijah was capable of, and seeing him out of the dementia ward was his absolute worst nightmare coming to life right before his eyes. We stood there in the doorway, soaking in their absolute terror. My parents were completely trapped by their own toxic vanity and their desperate need for social validation. If they were alone, they would have screamed at me and tried to physically shove us out of the room. They would have demanded to know how I broke him out of the secure medical facility. But they were not alone. They were completely surrounded by their elite social circle and the head pastor of their church. They had spent years building the illusion of a perfect, loving family, and they could not risk shattering that image in front of the most important people in their tight-knit community. They were forced to sit there in complete silence, choking on their own massive lies. Grandpa Elijah slowly smoothed the lapels of his vintage charcoal suit. He looked directly at my mother, his dark eyes pinning her to her chair like a helpless insect on display. "Good evening, Yvonne," he said, his deep, resonant voice carrying perfectly across the silent, extravagant dining room. "I heard you were preparing for the worst, so I decided to come and celebrate my own funeral." The church ladies gasped softly, exchanging confused and horrified glances with each other. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. The luxurious farewell party had officially been hijacked, and the Williams family was completely powerless to stop it. My mother Yvonne recovered faster than I thought humanly possible. She forced a bright, artificial smile onto her face and let out a loud, nervous laugh that sounded more like a choke. "It is an absolute miracle," she announced to the room, clapping her hands together wildly. "The doctors told us just yesterday to prepare for the worst, but the Lord has truly blessed us tonight." She rushed over to my grandfather, acting like the devoted, loving daughter she pretended to be. Pastor Davis immediately began praising God for the miraculous recovery, completely oblivious to the sheer panic radiating from my parents. My father Desmond quickly pulled up 2 extra chairs to the massive mahogany table, his hands shaking violently as he avoided my gaze. I parked my grandfather's wheelchair right at the head of the table where he absolutely belonged and took the seat next to him, resting my aluminum crutches against the expensive wallpaper. The grand dinner service resumed, but the atmosphere was incredibly thick with unspoken tension. The wealthy socialites went back to their imported caviar and expensive wine, but they kept stealing confused glances at our end of the table. Spencer knew he had to regain control of the narrative before the whispers started spreading among the church elders. He stood up from his chair, smoothing his expensive custom suit, and raised his crystal glass of amber whiskey. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding the attention of the entire private dining room. "I want to make a toast," he declared, projecting his voice with that fake venture capitalist confidence he had practiced for years. "To strong family values and the incredible financial success that allows us to celebrate together in such luxury tonight." He looked lovingly at Dominique, who was forcing a stiff smile while twisting her silk napkin. He talked endlessly about how hard he had worked to build his tech startup empire from the ground up and how much he appreciated my parents for their unwavering belief in his vision. He used ridiculous buzzwords talking about synergy and global market disruption, trying to sound as wealthy as possible. He even had the sheer audacity to look directly at me and my grandfather, thanking us for making the effort to come out, despite our severe health challenges. He raised his glass higher, asking everyone to drink to the future of the Williams family legacy. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down gently on the white tablecloth. "You really are a massive inspiration, Spencer," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft classical background music. "It takes a very special kind of man to achieve that level of success so quickly, especially considering where your primary funding really comes from." The entire table grew awkwardly quiet. Spencer gripped his whiskey glass much tighter, his knuckles turning entirely white. "What exactly do you mean by that, Talia?" he asked, trying desperately to keep his tone light and playful for the audience. "Oh, I just mean you are incredibly resourceful," I replied, smiling sweetly at him. "I admire how you always find a creative way to make things work, even when the federal government is breathing right down your neck." The church ladies exchanged nervous looks and murmurs. My mother kicked my good leg hard under the table, but I did not even flinch. Spencer let out a loud, forced chuckle, pulling his suit cuff back to casually display his heavy gold watch to the crowd. "Well, hard work always pays off," he said, gesturing broadly to the room. "You just have to know how to play the corporate game and make the absolute right investments." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "That is a truly beautiful watch, Spencer," I noted, staring directly at the shiny gold face. "Is that a genuine Rolex?" Dominique puffed up her chest immediately, defending her husband's fake wealth. "It is an exclusive custom piece," she bragged loudly for everyone to hear. "Spencer bought it to celebrate his latest international corporate merger." I tilted my head, pretending to examine the watch closely from across the table. "It is incredibly shiny," I observed loudly. "But you know, the interesting thing about those custom luxury pieces is how easily the cheap gold plating chips off when you sweat too much. And you look like you are sweating quite a bit right now, Spencer. It is also fascinating how your watch ticks loudly when a real Rolex is supposed to have a completely silent sweeping movement." A few of the church elders shifted uncomfortably in their plush seats. Spencer quickly pulled his sleeve down, covering the watch entirely. He sat down heavily in his chair, his face flushing a deep, angry red. His smooth venture capitalist charm was rapidly dissolving under the heavy pressure of my passive-aggressive remarks. My mother desperately tried to change the subject, asking Pastor Davis about the upcoming charity clothing drive, but the damage was already done. The room was buzzing with thick, uncomfortable tension beneath the forced, polite smiles. Every single time Spencer tried to join a conversation, I would casually mention something about hidden overseas bank accounts or fake financial portfolios. He was trapped at a dinner table with the exact people he was actively defrauding and the one woman who knew exactly what he was doing. The lavish 5-course dinner dragged on for another agonizing hour. The elite guests ate their roasted duck and chocolate truffles, while my family choked on their silent fear. Grandpa Elijah sat quietly at the head of the table, eating his expensive meal with absolute dignity. He did not say another word, but his intense dark eyes watched every single move my parents made. He was enjoying the psychological torture just as much as I was. Finally, the heavy ceramic plates were cleared away by the attentive restaurant staff. The wealthy socialites began checking their phones and fixing their makeup, preparing to leave. My mother breathed a visible heavy sigh of relief, thinking they had successfully survived the dinner without a massive public scandal. Then the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open one last time. The head waiter walked in carrying a sleek black leather folder. He walked straight past my father and stopped directly behind Spencer. The waiter placed the folder gently on the mahogany table, right next to Spencer's empty whiskey glass. "Your bill for the evening, sir," the waiter said politely, bowing his head slightly. "The grand total comes to $8,500. The entire table fell completely silent, waiting for the successful venture capitalist to treat them to the luxurious meal. Spencer smiled arrogantly, pulling a heavy black credit card from his designer leather wallet. He tossed the card onto the little silver tray with a loud, confident smack. He had absolutely no idea that I had frozen every single account he had access to exactly 20 minutes ago. The waiter picked up the heavy black metal card from the silver tray with a polite nod. He turned around and walked quietly toward the point-of-sale terminal located just outside the private dining room. Spencer immediately went back to his loud conversation with Pastor Davis, completely unbothered. He was actively describing the private yacht he claimed to have chartered for his upcoming trip to Italy. Dominique was applying a fresh layer of expensive lip gloss, using the reflection of her silver butter knife. My mother Yvonne was busy signaling the waitstaff for more sparkling water, trying to maintain the atmosphere of extreme luxury. I just sat quietly next to Grandpa Elijah, resting my hands on my lap. The countdown had officially reached 0 and the explosion was only seconds away. It did not take long at all. The heavy oak doors swung open and the head waiter stepped back into the room, but he was not carrying the leather folder with a printed receipt and a pen. He walked directly up to Spencer, holding the black credit card pinched tightly between his fingers. He leaned down slightly, keeping his voice low and discreet, trying to preserve the dignity of the wealthy guest. "I am so sorry, sir," the waiter whispered, "but your card has been declined. Would you happen to have another form of payment tonight?" The private dining room was relatively quiet, so the waiter's low voice carried just enough for the people sitting nearby to hear. Dominique stopped applying her lip gloss, her hand freezing in midair. Spencer let out a loud, arrogant laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "That is completely ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "It is probably just a security fraud alert. You know how these ultra-premium bank accounts are always flagging large restaurant purchases. Just run it again, or try this one." He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a heavy silver corporate card, tossing it onto the table. The waiter picked it up with a tight professional smile and walked back out of the room. Spencer took a large gulp of his amber whiskey, suddenly looking a little bit flushed. He tried to resume his story about the Italian coastline, but his voice had lost its smooth, confident rhythm. He kept glancing nervously toward the oak doors, waiting for the waiter to return and validate his extreme wealth. Pastor Davis gave Spencer a polite but slightly confused smile, gently swirling the water in his glass. My mother Yvonne shifted uncomfortably in her plush velvet chair, her eyes darting between Spencer and the church ladies sitting across the table. She absolutely hated any kind of public embarrassment, and a declined credit card was the ultimate social sin in her elite circle. Less than 2 minutes later, the waiter returned. This time, his professional smile was completely gone, replaced by a look of deep discomfort. He placed the silver corporate card directly onto the table right in front of Spencer. "I apologize again, sir," the waiter said, his voice a little louder this time. "This card has also been declined by your financial institution. The system is showing a hard lock on the account." The soft background music suddenly seemed incredibly loud. As the conversation at the long mahogany table ground to an absolute halt, the wealthy African-American socialites stopped eating their expensive chocolate truffles and turned their heads to stare directly at Spencer. The thick illusion of his massive tech empire was starting to crack right down the middle. Spencer wiped a sudden bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He grabbed his phone from the table, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to open his mobile banking application. There must be a glitch in the banking network, he stammered, his voice pitching up an entire octave. This makes absolutely no sense. My accounts are heavily funded. My mother could not handle the humiliating silence for another second. She desperately needed to save face in front of her high society friends. "Oh, Spencer, please do not even worry about it," she announced with a loud, shrill laugh that echoed terribly in the quiet room. "It is probably just a banking error. You are far too busy running your massive company to deal with annoying bank algorithms. Let me handle this bill tonight. It is our absolute pleasure to treat our wonderful family anyway." She reached into her expensive designer handbag and confidently pulled out her shiny platinum credit card, handing it directly to the waiter. "Take care of this, please," she instructed, waving her hand like a dismissing queen. The waiter took her platinum card and left the room for the third time. My mother smiled warmly at the church ladies trying to project an image of effortless generosity. "We are just so incredibly blessed," she told them, patting her diamond necklace. "What is a few $1,000s when you are celebrating family right?" The ladies nodded politely, but their eyes were sharp and judgmental. They were smelling blood in the water. I looked at Grandpa Elijah and saw the faintest trace of a ruthless smile playing on his lips. He was watching his arrogant daughter dig herself into a massive, inescapable hole. When the waiter returned, he did not even try to be discreet. He walked up to my mother and placed her shiny platinum card back onto the silver tray. "Mom, your card has been completely declined," the waiter announced clearly for the entire table to hear. "The authorization center says your account has been frozen due to suspicious activity." My mother's face dropped completely. The chalky white color returned to her cheeks as she stared at the little piece of plastic like it had suddenly caught fire. "That is absolutely impossible," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "I am a premier client. Run it again right now." The waiter shook his head firmly. "I already tried it twice, Mom. It is a hard decline." My mother spun around in her chair, looking wildly at my father Desmond, who was quietly trying to shrink into the expensive wallpaper. "Desmond, give him your card right now," she hissed, her voice completely losing its polite socialite tone. "Pay this ridiculous bill so we can leave this awful restaurant." My father fumbled nervously with his wallet, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the floor. He pulled out his own credit card and handed it to the waiter, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The entire dining room watched in absolute stunned silence as the waiter took the final card and walked away. The tension was so thick you could practically cut it with a steak knife. Dominique was staring at Spencer with a look of pure, terrified confusion. Spencer was frantically tapping his phone screen, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray as he realized he was completely locked out of every single financial account he possessed. He looked up and met my eyes across the table. I gave him a slow, chilling smile, raising my water glass in a silent, mocking toast to his ruined future. He instantly knew that I was the one pulling the strings. The head waiter walked back into the private dining room carrying my father's credit card. "Declined," the waiter said flatly, dropping it onto the table. At this point, the wealthy guests could no longer contain their reactions. Loud whispers erupted across the long mahogany table. The women from the church auxiliary board were leaning in close to each other, exchanging horrified and delighted gossip about the Williams family financial ruin. Pastor Davis frowned deeply, crossing his arms over his chest, as he looked at my parents with severe disappointment. The flawless image they had spent decades building was completely shattered in a matter of 5 minutes. My mother was hyperventilating, clutching her chest, as she realized her elite friends were actively laughing at her. "This is a massive mistake," she cried out, standing up from her chair. I demand to speak to the manager of this restaurant immediately. Your payment terminals are obviously broken and you are publicly humiliating my family. The head waiter did not even flinch at her aggressive tone. I have already informed the general manager about the situation, ma'am, the waiter replied, stepping back from the table. He is on his way right now. The loud whispers in the room suddenly died down as heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. The massive oak doors to the private dining room were pushed open very slowly. The general manager of the exclusive restaurant stepped into the room looking incredibly serious. But he was not alone. The entire family froze in absolute terror as they saw who was walking right behind him. The manager was flanked on both sides by two tall, heavily armed uniformed police officers. The two police officers stepped into the brightly lit dining room, their heavy black boots thudding against the polished hardwood floor. The silver badges on their dark uniforms caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The general manager walked a few steps ahead of them, clutching the 3 declined credit cards in his hand. He stopped at the head of the table, pointing directly at Spencer and my mother. The entire room fell into a dead silent hush. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the thick carpet. Pastor Davis slowly stood up from his chair, looking incredibly alarmed. The wealthy women from the church auxiliary board leaned away from the table, acting as if my parents suddenly had a highly contagious disease. They clutched their designer purses tightly to their chests, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. The lead police officer stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his thick leather duty belt. He looked down at the credit cards the manager had placed on the table and then looked directly at Spencer. Are you the individual attempting to authorize a payment of $8,500 using these accounts? The officer asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Spencer swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly above his tight silk tie. He tried to force a confident venture capitalist smile, but his lips were trembling uncontrollably. There has been a massive misunderstanding, officer, Spencer stammered, his voice cracking terribly. My banking institution simply made an administrative error and we are currently sorting it out right now. We are excellent customers and there is absolutely no need for law enforcement. The police officer did not smile or back down. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket and flipped it open. This is not a simple administrative error, sir, the officer stated loudly for the entire room to hear. The financial institution did not just decline the transaction tonight. They issued a priority security alert across their entire network. These specific credit cards have been officially flagged by the federal banking authorities. The accounts are currently under active investigation for association with stolen funds and fraudulent wire transfers. We have been instructed to confiscate these cards immediately and file a police report regarding the attempted use of frozen assets. A collective gasp rippled through the private dining room. One of the church ladies actually dropped her expensive crystal wine glass onto the floor, shattering it into a dozen jagged pieces. The dark red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, looking exactly like fresh blood. Dominique let out a high-pitched shriek, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. She looked at Spencer as if he had just turned into a monster right in front of her eyes. My father, Desmond, slumped down in his chair, burying his face in his hands, entirely defeated. He knew the federal government was finally closing in on the massive tax fraud Spencer had committed using his name. He knew his life of luxury was completely over. But my mother, Yvonne, did not surrender quietly. The sheer humiliation of being investigated for stolen funds in front of her elite social circle completely broke her mind. The perfectly manicured, polite socialite facade she had worn for decades violently shattered into a million pieces. She stood up so fast her heavy velvet chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor with a loud bang. Her face turned an angry bright red, and the veins in her neck bulged out as she pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "This is her fault!" my mother screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the vaulted ceilings. "She did this to us. She hacked into my banking accounts and froze my money because she is a jealous, bitter little girl." She stomped around the edge of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the 2 armed police officers standing just a few feet away. She pointed her finger right in my face, her expensive perfume suddenly smelling sour and metallic beneath the heavy sweat of her panic. "You ruined my perfect evening, Talia," she shrieked, spitting the words at me with pure venom. "You could not stand to see your sister happy and wealthy, so you planned this entire sick sabotage to humiliate us in public. You are a disgusting, ungrateful child, and I want you out of my sight right now." She spun around to face the general manager, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. "Throw her out of this restaurant right this second," my mother demanded frantically, gesturing toward me and my aluminum crutches. "She is a criminal. Arrest her, officer. She is the one stealing from this family. She is trying to ruin my flawless reputation because she is a complete failure in her own life." I did not move a single inch. I sat perfectly still in my plush chair, resting my hands calmly on my lap, watching her have a complete mental breakdown in front of her pastor and her wealthy friends. I let her scream and spit and dig her own social grave. Every single toxic word she yelled only proved how incredibly vain and abusive she truly was. Pastor Davis looked at my mother with absolute disgust, shaking his head slowly. The elite socialites were already pulling their expensive cashmere coats over their shoulders, desperate to escape the embarrassing scene. They were watching a supposedly elegant woman turn into a rabid animal over a declined credit card. The high society prestige she valued more than her own daughter was burning to the ground. Spencer tried to grab my mother's arm to quiet her down, realizing that screaming at me in front of the police was only making them look more guilty. But my mother violently shoved him away, completely lost in her hysterical rage. She took a step toward me, raising her hand as if she was actually going to strike me right there in the dining room. "You are going to pay for this, Talia," she hissed, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "I am going to make sure you have absolutely nothing left to your name." She never got the chance to finish her terrible threat. The heavy silence that followed her screaming was suddenly broken by a sound that completely stopped the blood in her veins. It was the distinct metallic click of the brakes being locked on a medical wheelchair. Next to me, Grandpa Elijah placed his strong, weathered hands firmly on the leather armrests of his chair. He did not look like a frail dementia patient anymore. He looked exactly like the ruthless real estate tycoon who had built a massive financial empire from the dirt. He took a deep, steady breath and slowly pushed himself forward. My mother froze mid-step, her raised hand dropping limply to her side as her eyes widened in absolute sheer horror. The church ladies stopped walking toward the door, completely paralyzed by the impossible sight. Even the two police officers took a step back in sheer surprise. With slow, deliberate strength, Grandpa Elijah pushed himself entirely out of the wheelchair, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, and stood up perfectly straight, towering over the silent dining room. Grandpa Elijah took a slow, deliberate step away from the wheelchair. My mother stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal water pitcher that shattered onto the floor. The sound was deafening, but nobody even blinked. They were all completely mesmerized by the impossible sight of my grandfather standing tall and proud. He did not look weak or confused. The blank stare of dementia he had carefully practiced for 2 entire years was completely gone. His dark eyes were razor-sharp, analyzing every single terrified face at the long mahogany table. He walked slowly but steadily past my father, who was shrinking violently into the floral wallpaper. The absolute silence in the room was heavier than solid concrete. Everyone watched as the supposedly dying patriarch reclaimed his physical and mental dominance without saying a single word. "You thought you had me completely figured out, Yvonne, my grandfather," said his voice booming, with absolute terrifying authority. "You thought the old man was finally brain dead, and you could just swoop in like a vulture to pick my bones clean. You locked me away in that miserable facility and did not even bother to bring me a decent cup of coffee or a fresh change of clothes. You just wanted my signature on those medical power of attorney papers so you could finally play Queen of the Castle." My mother was shaking her head frantically, tears of pure panic streaming down her ruined expensive makeup. "Daddy, please," she begged, her voice trembling violently. "You are sick. You are confused. You need to sit down in your chair before you hurt yourself. You do not know what you are saying right now. I am not confused at all, my grandfather snapped, cutting her off completely. I have never been more lucid in my entire life. I sat in that wretched chair for 2 long years, watching exactly how you and your weak husband treat people when you think nobody is holding you accountable. I watched you spoil your eldest daughter into a completely useless vain parasite. I watched you embrace a white criminal son-in-law just because he wore a nice tailored suit and talked about fake tech startups. And worst of all, I watched you abandon my youngest granddaughter in a hospital bed, stealing her inheritance to pay for a luxury vacation you did not even deserve. You sold your own flesh and blood for a trip to Italy. Pastor Davis took a sharp, shocked breath, stepping completely away from my parents, as if they were cursed. The wealthy women from the church auxiliary board were whispering furiously to each other, their eyes wide with absolute horror. My father Desmond finally found a tiny shred of his pathetic voice. Elijah, we were just managing the estate for you, he stammered, wiping heavy sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. We were protecting the family assets just like you always wanted us to do. Grandpa Elijah let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed loudly off the vaulted ceilings of the private dining room. Protecting my assets, he repeated, mocking my father's pathetic, weak tone. You are an absolute fool, Desmond. You do not even know what you are supposedly protecting. My grandfather turned his intense, piercing gaze toward the entire room, addressing the elite guests and the police officers directly. Every single thing this pathetic couple claims to own actually belongs entirely to me, he announced loudly, his voice ringing with undeniable truth. The sprawling brick colonial mansion they sleep in belongs to my living trust. The luxury cars they drove here tonight belong to my living trust. The country club memberships, the designer clothes, the massive bank accounts, none of it belongs to them. Legally speaking, Yvonne and Desmond Williams do not own a single piece of property to their names. They are completely and utterly broke. They are nothing but glorified tenants spending money they did not earn. The collective gasp from the elite African American socialites was incredibly loud and satisfying. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper, realizing her deepest, darkest secret had just been brutally exposed to the exact people she was desperately trying to impress. You have been living on my charity. My grandfather continued, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered disgust. I gave you provisional access to my wealth, hoping you would eventually use it wisely and take care of each other. But the moment you stole that $147,000 from Talia, you proved you were nothing but greedy, selfish thieves. So I am taking every single penny back right now. He reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a single sheet of heavy watermarked legal paper. As of yesterday afternoon, I have officially revoked all of your managerial rights to the family estate, he declared, holding the document up high for the police officers to see. I have completely frozen every bank account and voided every credit card connected to my trust. The wealth you have been showing off tonight is entirely gone. You will not have access to a single dime of my money ever again. You are going to have to learn how to survive in the real world without my massive wallet protecting your fragile egos. My parents looked like they had been physically struck by a massive speeding train. Their mouths hung open in silent agony. They realized they were standing in a 5-star restaurant with a massive unpayable bill, staring at federal bank fraud charges with absolutely no money to hire a defense lawyer. They had lost their home, their cars, and their entire social standing in less than 10 minutes. But Grandpa Elijah was not finished dropping destructive bombs on their lives. He turned toward me, placing a strong, warm hand on my shoulder. And to make sure my legacy is protected from parasites, he announced proudly, I have officially named Talia as the sole trustee and master of the entire Williams family estate. She controls everything now. My mother's face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at me sitting quietly with my aluminum crutches, realizing that the daughter she had verbally abused and cast aside was now the most powerful person in the room. The daughter she had aggressively threatened to disown just a few hours ago was now the legal owner of the very roof over her head. The absolute poetic justice of the moment was so incredibly sweet, I could actually taste it. The wealthy church ladies began slowly backing out of the private dining room, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the disgraced bankrupt family. The lead police officer stepped forward again, tapping his pen against his small notepad. "Well, sir, since these credit cards belong to a frozen trust account," the officer said, looking directly at Spencer, "we are going to need you to come down to the station to answer some very serious questions about attempted financial fraud." Spencer went completely pale, his entire fake venture capitalist persona crumbling into pathetic dust. He took a step backward, bumping hard into the mahogany table. But before the armed officers could even reach for their metal handcuffs, Dominique suddenly lost her mind. She lunged forward, placing herself directly between the police and her husband, screaming at the top of her lungs to defend the man who was actively destroying her life. Dominique pushed her hands aggressively against the chest of the lead police officer, her designer gown swishing wildly around her legs. "You cannot arrest him!" she shrieked, her voice echoing like a siren in the private dining room. "He is a highly successful venture capitalist, and you are making a massive mistake. My husband makes more money in a single week than you make in an entire year, so you better step away from him right now before I sue this entire police department." Spencer cowered behind his wife, using her slender body as a human shield against the armed officers. He was sweating profusely, looking around the room for any possible exit, but the heavy oak doors were completely blocked by the restaurant manager and the remaining waitstaff. The officers remained perfectly calm, simply asking Dominique to step aside before they were forced to charge her with obstruction of justice. I reached into my small leather bag and pulled out the thick stack of federal documents Julian had prepared for me. I tossed the heavy folder onto the mahogany table with a loud, sharp slap that instantly silenced my screaming sister. "Nobody is suing anyone, Dominique," I said, my voice cold and completely steady. "Your perfect husband is not going to Italy tomorrow, and he is definitely not a venture capitalist." Dominique turned her furious glare toward me, her chest heaving as she prepared to launch another verbal attack. But I did not give her the chance to speak. I opened the folder and pushed the first set of financial records across the smooth wood right toward her. "I want you to look very closely at those bank statements," I instructed loudly. "That is the $147,000 my parents stole from my trust fund today." But Spencer did not use it to book a romantic cliffside villa in the Amalfi Coast. He used it to pay off angry church investors who were preparing to report his massive Ponzi scheme to the federal authorities. Pastor Davis let out a loud gasp, stepping closer to the table to look at the documents. His face turned an angry shade of purple as he recognized the names of his own church members listed on the settlement papers. "Spencer has been stealing from the congregation for years." I continued, staring directly into Spencer's terrified eyes. "He blew the initial $2 million Grandpa Elijah loaned him, and then he started running a fake investment scam to keep you dressed in expensive silk, Dominique." Dominique shook her head violently, refusing to look at the papers. "That is a lie," she cried out, her voice shaking. "We have first-class tickets to Europe tomorrow morning." He showed me the itinerary on his phone. I pulled out the single printed airline confirmation from the folder and slid it across the table. "He did show you an itinerary, but he left out a very important detail," I replied ruthlessly. "There are no first-class tickets for two people. There is only one single coach ticket purchased under his name, and it is not a flight to Italy. It is a one-way ticket to a small island nation with absolutely no extradition laws to the United States. He was going to attend this lavish farewell dinner tonight, smile for the cameras, and then completely abandon you tomorrow morning. He was planning to leave you waking up alone in an empty mansion while he ran away with my inheritance." Dominique stared at the single flight confirmation, her hands trembling violently. She turned slowly to look at Spencer, her eyes begging him to deny it. But Spencer could not even look at her. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, completely defeated. His silence was the loudest confession in the entire room. Dominique let out a gut-wrenching sob, dropping to her knees, right there on the restaurant floor. Her expensive evening gown pooled around her as she realized her entire marriage was an elaborate, devastating scam. But the absolute worst part was not the fake trip or the stolen trust fund money. I turned my attention to my parents, who were still standing frozen in shock. I pulled out the final stack of papers, featuring the intimidating seal of the Internal Revenue Service. I held up the federal documents for everyone in the room to clearly see. Spencer did not just run a Ponzi scheme, I announced, my voice echoing with grim finality. He stopped paying his federal corporate taxes over 3 years ago. And when the federal government finally came to collect their massive debt, Spencer needed a quick way to protect himself, so he stole his own family identities. My father, Desmond, let out a strange, choking noise, taking a weak step forward. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his face completely devoid of any color. His hands were shaking so terribly he had to lean against the back of his chair just to remain standing. I dropped the IRS documents onto the table right in front of him. "He stole your social security numbers, Dad," I said bluntly, without a single ounce of sympathy. "He forged your signatures, and he legally bound both you and Mom as the primary guarantors for his failing shell company. You are entirely responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal back taxes and massive financial penalties. And because you signed those original trust documents giving him his seed money years ago, the federal government considers you active co-conspirators in his fraud." My mother, Yvonne, let out a horrifying shriek, grabbing her hair with both hands. "No," she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet room. "We did not know anything about a scam. We just wanted to help him succeed. We are good, upstanding members of this community." "The federal agents are not going to care about your socialite reputation, Mom," I replied coldly. "When they raid his fake office tomorrow, they are coming directly for you. You are facing complete federal bankruptcy and actual prison time. You sacrificed your own injured daughter and stole my grandfather money just to protect a criminal who secretly built a federal prison cell with your names written right on the door." The lead police officer had heard absolutely enough. He stepped around the sobbing Dominique and grabbed Spencer roughly by his expensive tailored shoulder. Spencer did not even try to fight back. He went completely limp as the officer spun him around and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the sound of my mother hyperventilating. Spencer was officially under arrest for attempted wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The officers began dragging the disgraced venture capitalist out of the private dining room. The wealthy church ladies were actively recording the entire humiliating scene on their cell phones, eager to share the massive scandal with the rest of the affluent neighborhood. My parents stood entirely frozen beside the mahogany table, staring at the federal tax documents with blank, dead eyes. The terrifying realization finally crashed down on them with the heavy, destructive force of a falling building. The perfect white son-in-law they had worshipped and protected above their own flesh and blood had just completely destroyed their entire lives. The heavy wooden doors of the private dining room swung shut behind the police officers, leaving a devastating silence in their wake. Spencer was gone, and with him went the entire fake foundation of the Williams family empire. Dominique was still collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her ruined designer dress. She looked like a broken porcelain doll, completely discarded by the man she had worshipped. But my attention was entirely focused on my father, Desmond. He had spent my entire life standing quietly in the background, letting my mother tear me down, letting Spencer steal from us, and refusing to ever be a real parent to me. Now the consequences of his endless cowardice were finally crashing down directly onto his shoulders. My father's legs suddenly gave out completely. He collapsed onto his knees right there on the expensive dining room carpet. The loud thud of his knees hitting the floor made my mother jump in terror. Desmond looked up at me, and his face was completely unrecognizable. The proud, wealthy patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken old man. Heavy tears streamed down his wrinkled face, soaking into his expensive silk shirt collar. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, looking up at me from the floor like a beggar pleading for his life. "Talia, please," he sobbed. his voice cracking terribly in the quiet room. "Please, you have to help us. You are the trustee now. You have access to all of Grandpa Elijah money. You can hire the best defense lawyers in the city. You can pay off the federal government and make this entire nightmare go away. We are your family, Talia. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot just let us go to federal prison. I am an old man, and your mother would absolutely not survive behind bars. You have to save us. We made a terrible mistake, but we are still your parents." He was openly weeping, begging for salvation from the exact same daughter he had abandoned in a hospital bed just a few days ago. My mother Yvonne had fallen into a neighboring chair, completely paralyzed by shock, holding her face in her hands and rocking back and forth. She did not even have the strength to yell anymore. The wealthy socialites from her church had completely vanished, slipping out the side doors to distance themselves from the massive federal crime scene. We were the only ones left in the destroyed private dining room, alongside the restaurant manager and Grandpa Elijah. I looked down at my father kneeling on the floor, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no sadness, and no lingering guilt. The little girl who used to crave his love and protection had completely died on that hospital bed when he let them steal her inheritance. I leaned heavily on my aluminum crutches and took one step closer to him, looking down into his pathetic, crying eyes. "Do you remember what you told me in the hospital recovery room, Dad?" I asked, my voice freezing cold and echoing loudly in the empty room. "Do you remember standing there while I was bleeding from broken ribs, begging you to tell me where my trust fund went? You told me you used it to pay for a luxury vacation because Dominique was feeling a little bit sad. And when the nurse handed me a $15,000 medical bill, I could not pay, you did not even blink. Do you remember the exact words you said to me right before you walked out the door to go to a wine tasting party?" My father choked on his own tears, shaking his head weakly. "Please, Talia," he begged again, reaching a trembling hand out toward my cast. "I am so deeply sorry." "Oh," I stepped back, pulling my injured leg away from his touch. "You told me I was a big girl now." I reminded him loudly, refusing to let him escape his own cruelty. "You told me I was completely independent and that I should just use my medical insurance to handle it. You told me to figure out my own problems because the family needed to protect its image. You walked away and left me completely penniless and trapped in a hospital bed without a single ounce of guilt." I paused, letting the heavy silence wrap around his throat like a tight rope. "So that is exactly my advice to you tonight, Dad," I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, ruthless whisper. "Just use your insurance to handle it. Use your insurance to pay off the federal government and hire a criminal defense lawyer. You are a big boy now. Figure it out yourself." My father let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping his face into his hands. But Grandpa Elijah was not quite finished twisting the knife. He stood tall beside me, looking down at his pathetic son-in-law with pure disgust. "Oh, wait." Grandpa Elijah interrupted, his deep voice slicing through my father's sobs. "Talia is absolutely right, Desmond. You should definitely use your insurance policies to save yourself. Oh, wait. There is just one tiny little problem with that brilliant plan. Your massive life insurance policies and your personal retirement accounts were just seized by the bank this morning. Because Spencer used your social security numbers to guarantee those fraudulent loans, the federal investigators have completely frozen your remaining personal assets. You do not even have enough money left to buy a bus ticket home." The absolute finality of Grandpa Elijah's words completely shattered whatever tiny sliver of hope my parents had left. My father collapsed entirely onto the floor, curling into a fetal position and weeping loudly. My mother let out a long, hollow moan that sounded like a dying animal. The restaurant manager finally stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, but his tone was completely professional and firm. "I am going to have to ask you all to leave my restaurant immediately," the manager instructed, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors. "You have caused a massive disturbance, and we need to close this private dining room. If you do not leave right now, I will have the police escort you off the premises." Grandpa Elijah adjusted his tailored suit jacket and nodded respectfully to the manager. "We are leaving right now," Sir Grandpa said calmly. "I apologize for the terrible mess my former family has caused." Grandpa turned and walked slowly but confidently toward the exit, leaving his empty wheelchair behind. I adjusted my crutches and followed him, not looking back at the crying, pathetic people on the floor. The restaurant security guards had to physically lift Dominique and my parents off the carpet, dragging them toward the main exit of the luxurious building. We walked out through the grand lobby of the five-star restaurant, the night air feeling incredibly crisp and refreshing against my face. But the nightmare was not quite over for the Williams family. As the security guards pushed my sobbing parents and my sister out through the heavy glass revolving doors, a blinding flash of bright white light suddenly exploded in the darkness. We stepped onto the sidewalk and realized the street was completely chaotic. Julian had tipped off the local media about the massive federal arrest of a prominent venture capitalist. 3 separate local news vans were parked illegally along the curb. Half a dozen reporters and camera crews were swarming the entrance, holding bright spotlights and heavy microphones directly in my parents' terrified faces. The blinding camera flashes from the local news crews marked the absolute end of the Williams family pristine public image. I watched from the tinted window of the private town car Julian had hired as my mother desperately tried to cover her face with her expensive designer handbag. My father just stood there completely frozen in the harsh glare of the television spotlights, while reporters shouted aggressive questions about federal tax fraud and stolen investments. It was the exact public humiliation my mother had spent her entire life trying to avoid. Julian drove Grandpa Elijah and me back to the safe house, leaving my parents and my sister to navigate the chaotic media circus entirely alone. 3 weeks passed since that explosive night at the restaurant. I officially took over the massive responsibility of managing the Revocable Living Trust. Julian helped me set up a beautiful private office in a high-rise building downtown so I could handle the estate properly. I spent my days organizing the complex financial portfolios and finalizing the capital I needed to open my community pharmacy. I was actively reviewing commercial leases for a beautiful storefront property in a neighborhood that desperately needed an independent pharmacy. My fractured ribs were finally starting to heal, and I had upgraded from using aluminum crutches to a single walking cane. My life was moving forward beautifully, but the toxic remnants of my family were entirely stuck in the dark nightmare they had created for themselves. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the heavy glass doors of my new office suddenly burst open. My receptionist stood up in alarm, trying to stop the frantic woman pushing her way into the quiet reception area. I looked up from my laptop screen and almost did not recognize my own sister. Dominique looked absolutely dreadful. The pristine golden child who demanded absolute perfection was completely gone. Her expensive blonde highlights were growing out, showing dark, messy roots. She was wearing a pair of faded sweatpants and an oversized hoodie that looked like she had slept in it for a week. Her eyes were swollen and terribly bloodshot, and she had completely chewed her manicured fingernails down to the raw skin. Talia. "Please, you have to talk to me," Dominique pleaded, pushing past the receptionist and stumbling directly into my private office. She collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, breathing heavily. I raised my hand, signaling my receptionist that it was fine to leave us alone for a moment. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my ruined sister. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands calmly on my mahogany desk. "What do you want, Dominique?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk with trembling hands. "I need a loan, Talia," she begged, her voice cracking with pure desperation. Spencer bail was denied because the judge considers him a massive flight risk. He is sitting in a federal holding cell right now, and the public defender they assigned him is an absolute joke. I need $500,000 to hire a top-tier criminal defense team for him. He is going to rot in federal prison if we do not fight these charges immediately. You control all the money now, Talia. You have millions of dollars sitting in those trust accounts doing absolutely nothing. You are my sister, and it is your duty to help your family in a time of crisis." I stared at her, completely fascinated by her pure, unbroken delusion. "You want me to give you $500,000 to defend the man who stole my inheritance?" I asked slowly, letting the absolute absurdity of her request fill the quiet room. You want me to drain the accounts Grandpa Elijah worked his entire life to build, just so your fake venture capitalist husband can hire a fancy lawyer. You want me to fund a criminal defense for a man who forged our parents' signatures and destroyed their lives just to save himself. Dominique shook her head frantically, hot tears spilling down her pale cheeks. It was a mistake, Talia, she cried out, defending him just like she always did. He was just under so much pressure to provide for our family. He was trying to build a massive empire for us. You have to understand that he truly loves me. He would never intentionally hurt us. I felt a cold, ruthless anger rise in my chest. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a printed copy of the single one-way airline ticket to the island nation. I slid it across the smooth wood right to her trembling fingertips. He does not love you, Dominique, I stated brutally, cutting through her pathetic lies. He was leaving you. He packed his bags and bought a single ticket to escape the country while leaving you to face the federal agents entirely alone. He used you for your massive trust fund allowance, and when the money finally ran out, he was going to throw you away like garbage. Dominique squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the paper. You are just jealous, she whispered, her voice shaking with weak venom. You have always been jealous of me because I was the beautiful one. I was the one Mom and Dad actually loved and paid attention to. You are just using this trust fund to punish me because you are deeply miserable inside. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Jealous of what exactly? I asked, leaning forward over the desk. Jealous that you are 32 years old and have never worked a single honest day in your entire life. Jealous that your entire identity was wrapped up in a fake venture capitalist who bought you designer clothes with stolen money. You are a 32-year-old parasite, Dominique. You have spent your entire life feeding off the hard work of Grandpa Elijah and the toxic validation of our mother. You stood in my hospital room complaining about a dress fitting while I was bleeding from broken bones. You cheered when our parents stole my future to fund your luxury vacation. And now you are sitting here begging me for money because you have absolutely nothing left. Dominique sobbed loudly, burying her face in her arms on my desk. You are cruel, she wept loudly, her tears staining the polished wood. You are a cold, heartless monster, and you are going to end up completely alone. I am just holding up a mirror, I replied coldly, pressing the intercom button on my telephone. Security, please come up to my office, I instructed calmly. I have an unauthorized visitor who needs to be escorted out of the building. Dominique shot up from her chair, her eyes wide with shock and fury. You cannot do this to your own sister, she screamed as two large security guards stepped into the office. I am family, Talia. You cannot just throw me out on the street like this. I picked up my pen and went back to reviewing my pharmacy business plan, completely ignoring her screaming. You threw me away a long time ago, Dominique, I said without looking up. Have a nice life. The security guards grabbed her firmly by the arms and dragged her out of my office. Her hysterical screams faded down the hallway until the heavy glass doors finally shut, silencing her forever. I took a deep breath, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The golden child was finally completely powerless. But her humiliation was nothing compared to the absolute social destruction that was about to hit my parents. By the time Sunday morning arrived, the entire affluent African-American community was completely buzzing with the scandalous news of the Williams family downfall. Pastor Davis stood at his heavy wooden pulpit and delivered a blistering, fiery sermon about the devastating sins of vanity and greed. He did not explicitly mention my parents by name, but every single person sitting in those polished wooden pews knew exactly who he was talking about. He spoke about the dangers of building a house on a foundation of lies and how the pursuit of material wealth would eventually rot the soul from the inside out. The local news had run the story of the massive federal arrest for 3 consecutive days, featuring very clear footage of my mother screaming at the police outside the restaurant. The pristine social reputation she had spent decades meticulously building was completely incinerated in a matter of hours. On Monday afternoon, the church auxiliary board held an emergency meeting. My mother, Yvonne, had served as the president of that board for 7 years, using her elite position to judge and belittle anyone who did not meet her ridiculous financial standards. They voted unanimously to strip her of her title and permanently remove her from the committee, citing a moral clause in their organizational bylaws. When she tried to call her wealthy high society friends to complain and beg for sympathy, they simply let her calls go straight to voicemail. The elite women she used to drink expensive wine and play tennis with completely shunned her acting as if she had suddenly died. In their highly exclusive circles, poverty and federal criminal investigations were the ultimate unforgivable diseases. But the severe social isolation was only the very beginning of their punishment. The Revocable Living Trust officially initiated the legal eviction process for the Grand Colonial Mansion. Grandpa Elijah was absolutely merciless. He gave them exactly 1 week to pack their personal belongings and vacate the massive property. I drove over to the neighborhood on the final day of their eviction, parking my car across the street just to watch the fake empire officially fall. The sprawling manicured lawn where my mother used to host lavish catered garden parties was now littered with cheap cardboard boxes and black plastic trash bags. Because Spencer had forged their names on the federal tax documents, the bank had completely seized all of their personal luxury assets. The shiny Mercedes and the heavy luxury sport utility vehicle were towed away earlier that week. They were not allowed to take any of the expensive antique furniture, the crystal chandeliers, or the massive flat-screen televisions, because those were all legally owned by the trust. They were only permitted to take their basic clothes, their toiletries, and whatever small personal items they could fit into the back of a rented moving truck. I watched through my windshield as my father Desmond struggled to carry a heavy box of old coats down the long brick driveway. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders hunched deeply and his face gray with pure exhaustion. My mother trailed silently behind him, clutching a single designer handbag she had managed to hide from the ruthless bank auditors. They looked like complete strangers, entirely stripped of the blinding arrogance that used to define their entire existence. They were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the complete opposite side of the city near the industrial district. It was a rough neighborhood my mother used to actively mock, locking her car doors whenever we drove past it in her luxury vehicles. The small apartment had stained carpets, peeling paint, and paper-thin walls. There was no heated swimming pool, no grand foyer, and absolutely no space for her massive ego. The claustrophobic, miserable reality of their new life immediately poisoned whatever small amount of loyalty they had left for each other. According to the private investigator Julian had hired to keep an eye on them, the cramped apartment quickly became a hostile war zone. Without their massive wealth to buffer their deeply flawed marriage, my parents completely turned on each other. My father screamed at my mother, blaming her endless social climbing and her blinding obsession with Spencer for ruining their lives. He yelled that if she had not pushed him to give Spencer that initial seed money to show off to the church, they would still be living in absolute luxury. My mother screamed right back at him, calling him a pathetic, weak coward. She blamed his sheer stupidity for signing the federal documents without reading them properly. She mocked him for failing to protect the family assets from Grandpa Elijah and for letting a weak, injured girl take over the entire trust. She screamed that he was never half the man Spencer was, even though Spencer was the exact person who put them in this miserable situation. They fought constantly, their bitter voices echoing through the thin walls of the cheap apartment complex for all their new neighbors to hear. They were drowning in massive federal debt, facing years of grueling legal battles, and they had absolutely no one left to blame but themselves. Dominique eventually moved into the tiny second bedroom of that miserable apartment a few weeks later after the bank officially foreclosed on her own massive house. The ruined golden child and her toxic parents were finally trapped together in a tiny space, completely isolated from the wealthy world they once ruled. They had absolutely no money, no friends, and no hope of ever regaining their stolen status. The villainous side of the Williams family was completely and utterly shattered, left to suffocate forever under the heavy, crushing weight of their own terrible choices. One entire year has passed since that chaotic night outside the restaurant. The changing of the seasons brought a deep, profound peace to my life that I had never experienced while living under the heavy shadow of the Williams family. I am sitting on the wide wraparound porch of the new house I bought for myself, entirely on my own merit. The afternoon sun is casting long, golden shadows across the wooden floorboards, and a gentle summer breeze is rustling through the large oak trees in my front yard. I take a slow sip of ice-cold sweet tea, letting the sweet, familiar taste wash over me. For the first time in my 29 years of life, my chest does not ache with anxiety, and my mind is perfectly quiet. Right next to me, sitting in a comfortable wicker rocking chair, is Grandpa Elijah. He looks healthier and happier than he has in a decade. He is wearing a simple plaid shirt and comfortable jeans, completely retired from the heavy burden of managing his massive estate. He spends his days reading history books, tending to the small vegetable garden out back, and giving me brilliant advice whenever I ask for it. The heavy fake dementia and the miserable nursing home are nothing but a distant memory. He reclaimed his life the exact same night I reclaimed mine, and we have built a beautiful, peaceful existence together, far away from the toxic vanity of the people we left behind. The $147,000 that my parents tried to steal was completely recovered and put to its rightful purpose. 6 months ago, I proudly cut the red ribbon on my very own independent community pharmacy. I chose a location in a neighborhood that desperately needed accessible healthcare and honest medical advice. Every single morning, I unlock the glass doors of my business, and I feel an overwhelming sense of pride. I am not building an empire based on fake venture capital or stolen social security numbers. I am building a legacy based on hard work, genuine care for my patients, and the solid foundation my grandfather provided for me. My pharmacy is thriving because it is built on absolute truth. I have not spoken a single word to my parents or my sister since the night they were evicted from the colonial mansion. Julian told me that Spencer accepted a plea deal and is currently serving a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. Dominique is reportedly working a minimum wage retail job just to help our parents pay the rent on their cramped, miserable apartment. They are completely drowning in the massive federal debt Spencer left them, and they are entirely shunned by the affluent community they once ruled. They spend their days trapped in that tiny space, fighting bitterly with each other, blaming everyone but themselves for their spectacular downfall. I do not feel any guilt or sadness when I think about their miserable situation. I only feel a profound sense of relief that I am no longer part of their destructive cycle. Grandpa Elijah reaches over and gently clinks his glass of sweet tea against mine, breaking me out of my thoughts. He smiles at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute pride and genuine love. "You did good, Talia," he says, his deep voice warm and steady. "You built exactly what I always knew you could build." I smile back at him, feeling a sudden wave of emotion rise in my chest. "I did not do it alone, Grandpa," I reply softly. "I just finally learned how to protect what is actually mine." We sit together in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies slowly begin to light up the evening yard. It is a simple, quiet moment, but it is worth more than all the designer clothes and luxury vacations in the entire world. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the most difficult part of my journey was not the physical pain of my car accident or the massive task of taking over a multi-million-dollar trust. The hardest part was finally accepting the devastating truth that the people who were supposed to love and protect me were actually the ones destroying me. If you are a woman watching this right now, and you are currently suffocating under the heavy weight of a toxic family, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that is actively making you sick. You cannot fix people who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you and exploiting your kindness. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water and that we must always forgive our family members no matter how terribly they treat us. That is a dangerous lie designed to keep you trapped in a cycle of endless abuse. Sharing genetics with someone does not give them a permanent free pass to disrespect your boundaries, steal your peace, or drain your resources. Walking away from a toxic family is not an act of selfishness or cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are absolutely allowed to choose your own mental health over their comfort. You are allowed to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. It takes an incredible amount of strength to look at your own parents and realize they are incapable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved. It is terrifying to walk away and face the world entirely alone. But I promise you, the peace you will find on the other side of that difficult decision is beautiful beyond words. You will discover a deep well of resilience inside yourself that you never even knew existed. You will build your own chosen family with people who respect you, validate you, and celebrate your successes instead of being jealous of them. Do not let anyone convince you that you have to accept abuse just because they share your last name. Have you ever had to make the painful decision to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace and future? How did you find the strength to finally walk away from the people who constantly underestimated and exploited your worth? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories of survival and independence in the comments section below. Your journey matters, and sharing it might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today to finally break free from her own nightmare. If my story resonated with you or gave you the courage to stand up for yourself, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories of healing resilience and ultimate justice. Do not forget to share this video with anyone who might be struggling with difficult family dynamics right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey to freedom. Always remember that your life is entirely yours to build, and you deserve every single ounce of peace and happiness that comes your way. Stay strong, keep protecting your boundaries, and I will see you all in the very next video.